dig a little bit deeper on two areas that we explore in this report annually. One is performance. That is how the institution is doing against the standards that the institution itself has set to meet. And there are standards in different areas of sovereign, non-sovereign operations that have been set up overall and in specific sections of our performance of our projects, strategies, policies, programs. That's one area. The second area that we're going to discuss about is results. In the end, what does that mean for people on the ground? What did we change in the life of people that we are supposed to serve? We were hired for that purpose. And so that's the nature of this discussion. We'll talk first about performance, and then we'll talk about results. And we want to come back to you. Please save your questions and keep them there. Try to make some space so that we can have an interaction between you and this illustrious panel that we have this afternoon. So let's talk first then about performance. One of the good news that the report is bringing is the increase in the performance of CWRD. Good news for a number of years. Some of you are familiar with the fact that it was performing below the rest of the departments, which means regions as well. But now this improved performance, Werner, is reaffirmed not only at the project level, but also at the country level. So, Werner, can you explain to us what is it that has changed in the region and in the department that has led to this improved performance of the institution in this area?
Okay, thanks a lot. Just to illustrate and give a sense of what performance improvement in CWRD means, I looked at some figures. And I look at the period, the 3-year average 2014-16, and then more recently 2016-2018. And so we increased the PCR success rate from 58% to 75%. The PCR, and we use the PCR as a benchmark because it's more real-time than the evaluation reports. That went up from 40% for PBLs to 100% success. The PCR sustainability rating went up from 33%, which was really low, to 63%, which is still a bit low, but a marked improvement. And the gender equality aspect went up from 55% to 71%. So I do think that's a significant improvement. And what has changed and what has been the key challenge? You pointed out, of course, one problem for us always is change of government, and that continues to be a perennial issue in our region. It's not just that there's elections or short terms. I mean, even ministries are shuffled around quite frequent. But what helps a lot is that the resident missions have much more depth now. We have stronger resident missions. They were able to establish better connections with the bureaucracy. And even if the government changes, often the bureaucracy is the same. So if they put a new secretary in place, often we know that person, maybe in a different capacity. But that obviously helps that we don't have to re-educate people about our projects every time. Because that is really a problem. A new team comes in and they don't know how ADB works, and you spend a lot of time of re-educating them about how we do our business. The second thing that really made a big difference is, I think, project readiness. One of the main factors for the poor rating is that basically, if you lose the first or second year, you're never able to catch it up. And you invariably end up with some extension and things really get not so well. So to improve project readiness, of course, the bank has approved a couple of new instruments. One is the project readiness facility. We are actively using this. In fact, I think CWRD is the most active user of the project readiness facility. And Bernard can maybe elaborate further on this or not. But this year we're going to do 7 PRFs. And what they do is to make the project really design and procurement ready, but also looking at all the safeguard aspects. Now, of course, we looked into this also even before the PRF came in place, but I think this is an instrument which really helps us to make project ready. In fact, what we now want to do, that if a project is committed in 1 year, we want to have the first contract awarded ideally within the next 6 months, but at least within the year. And previously, it sometimes took 2 or 3 years to award a contract. And we will have much more certainty about the cost parameters. Often there is already a parallel bidding process ongoing while we come, so there's much more certainty on some of the project parameters. And of course, safeguard issues are all supposed to be resolved before we come. So, and I think that really will make a huge difference. The third aspect, which really helps us to address this issue, is we have really been working hard on the sustainability agenda. If you look at the ratings, I think it comes every time. I mean, project sustainability is the lowest. It's still relatively low. But when we do the project design, we really make a concerted efforts to look at sustainability. If you have a road project, you look at the O&M aspects, for instance, and I think this in the project design is very important. Likewise, on gender, I'm very happy to report that this year, not a single project in CWRD will have no gender elements. Every project has at least some gender elements. We have some program loans where gender elements are more problematic. But so I think there is, based on the feedback also that we have received, there is much more emphasis from the management team also to particularly look at these two issues, gender and sustainability. I'll stop here, but I hope that gives you an idea of what we have done to address the issues. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and congratulations again to your team, the entire team, and to the institution as a whole. No department here, and no single manager can deliver by themselves. All of this is a teamwork, we are engaged in a risky business. Development is a risky business. To a large extent, what we do does not depend on us. We provide hopefully good inputs, but it also depends on the context, and it depends on the partnership at the local level. One of the regions in which we face challenges is in the Pacific. And so AED Dawson, you see the institution as a whole, but you have a deep experience in the Pacific. And perhaps you could tell us a little bit of how you see the challenges that the institution is facing in that region. What are the gaps that the institution is facing in the region in order to improve performance? Performance in that region continues to be at the lowest level of the institution. So please, AED Dawson.
So thanks very much, and welcome everybody. I think it's pretty well known that performance in the Pacific has generally and historically been a lot lower than other regions. But I'm always a bit nervous about drawing sort of too many conclusions just from small numbers of ex-post evaluations. So I kind of looked back a couple of years through these reports, and the numbers on PNG, for example, which are one of the worst performing individual countries, they're really small. Like last year we had 3 transactions which were included. But there is, still enough of a reason to be concerned there. So I think sort of at one stage, PNG went for a number of years without a single successful rated project. So there's clearly sort of work that needs to be done. But I'm really impressed that of the encouraging signs that are coming through, and you see some of them in the kind of the overall ratings in this report. Greater success of completed operations. And I think that's been driven by a lot more focus on public sector management, a lot more attention to the cooperation and coordination with development partners, more country ownership of the reform agenda, and that's been helped, I think, by better quality and more technical assistance. But I always prefer to look sort of beyond what comes through from ex post evaluations of completed operations. And I got a really interesting report from PARD the other day, which was just a report on what they had been doing with initiatives to strengthen project implementation in the Pacific. And when you look at that, there are some quite dramatic performance improvements there. So the portfolio performance risk rating of PARD projects went from 57% on track in 2017 to 73% on track in 2018, which was on a par with the ADB average. And the uncontracted balance went down from 31% was reduced to 31%, which is lower than the ADB average. So there are lots of, I think, green shoots and good signs coming from the Pacific. And I think that that's been the result of a series of efforts of stepping up our engagement in the area and looking particularly at this issue of project implementation and preparation. So I don't think there's any kind of single silver bullet which will improve this, but it is a matter of sustaining capacity building, but not just kind of technical capacity building. It's thinking about capacity in the absolute big picture, which goes back to kind of basic human resource capacity and including basic education. More implementation support, and implementation support which is on tap, which can be easily accessed, which is a problem for small, isolated members that don't have everybody in a resident mission or easy access to it. I think the step up in our field presence has been really important and will be much more important the further that goes on. And I think just the use of larger, better designed programs has been a big change. So we're seeing a lot more things done on a regional basis, which can justify the kind of effort and resources that go into them, but which can benefit a number of countries. So I think there's a lot of things which are positives there, even though the historical picture is a bit dim.
Thank you, AD Dawson. Hopefully we will see these improvements reflected in performance going forward when we measure it in the years to come. Let us now turn to the private, non-sovereign side of the institution. We report in this paper an important decline in the performance of private sector operations to 56%. That's, again, in general, the business in which we are engaged is risky, it's complicated, and private sector operations, similar performance I've seen more recently in IFC that I used to evaluate. But there are specific reasons that explain that performance here, and so perhaps VP Gupta can illuminate us, shed some light of what's going on there, but more importantly, how to reverse that trend, if it is a trend. We've seen it for 2 years already, that we have been recording in performance of non-sovereign operations. VP Gupta, please.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Marvin. And let me first start with a disclaimer. The evaluation is about private sector projects, and therefore I am essentially conflicted in saying whatever I am going to say now. You see, when Marvin says you are great, you are fantastic, nothing, you couldn't have done anything better, I say Marvin is a great guy. I agree with him. But when Nathan says, look, you are only 56%, and by the way, these projects, these are the shortcomings, I say, you are missing something. You don't understand our business, you don't understand our risks, etc. So that's human nature. Let me try to now separate myself from that role and just go on the merits of what this is. So as far as, what is the purpose of IED evaluation? I personally think there are two very overarching purposes. The first is takeaways. What is the learning that you have from what you did? And the second is external. What is the messaging that you are giving? So ultimately, this report is required because the internal organization needs to improve after looking at it. And the external environment needs to perceive the organization for the actual state that it is in. If those two things are achieved, I think IED's job is brilliantly done. And it's a hard task because the fact is that when you are going into something, you are going to point out shortcomings or suggest improvements, and that often makes people defensive. So I think IED is doing a great job, and I have no divergence or difference or issue to join with what they have done. Marvin and his team have had great discussions with me many times, and we enjoy it. They go over time, and that's all fine. Now, when you say 56% or 67%, so I am now giving a defense after saying I am not giving a defense. But I'm just trying to split the issue to give you my perspective. We are looking at a 34 deal moving average when we say 56%. So if one deal every year were to move, that would move the average by 10%. So 10 or 11 deals a year. If one deal were to be classified a little differently, this average instead of 56 could have been 67. Then again, the 2012 to 14 would have been 17 deals average. 5 deals, 6 deals a year. And in 6 deals, if one deal were to move, that would be 20%. So while as a percentage, it looks like a big slippage from 67 to 56%, actually we are talking of one deal not having made it every year. Now, the argument can well be, well, this deal could have gone the other way and you should have been 80% instead of 67%. So that's granted. But statistically, it is a very small sample. That's one point which I want to make. The second is that, we are in different regions. So we are in the Pacific, we are in PRC, we are also in Afghanistan. And now IED obviously is absolutely right in applying the standards that it has for the framework. But the problem with evaluation is that it is very qualitative. And how do you get qualitative factors into a quantitative number is the question. For example, we did a deal in Myanmar, Ooredoo Telecom. There, 90% of the population is already included. They have mobiles. And 49% is women. Now, if this were to grow and they were to add another 500,000 connections, if they were to do everything right on gender, 49 would become 49.3. So is there enough additionality on gender in this deal? Or is it to say that, well, if you've been able to sustain 50%, that's great. Now, a matrix is not likely to capture this as great. But practically, you can't go over 50% for women because otherwise you will have to stop giving mobiles to men. Now, those are the qualitative aspects that come in. Now, again, the third thing is about projects being old. So, what we are looking at today happened in 2005. So, many of those learnings would have already got factored in. Or many of the assumptions of that time would have become different. We would have had a downturn in 2008, which was not factored in when you did a DMF in 2005. Now, when you evaluate in 2012 the performance in the context of the downturn, if a financial institution's deal has not lost money and sort of just got its loan back, is it a good thing or a bad thing? So, all I'm saying is that there are perspectives on how you evaluate that number. And that brings me to the messaging part. When you say it is 56%, is it good or is it bad? When I did my college, in the sciences, you would get about 84, 85, 90%. The guy who did economics or English literature would get 56% if he was the topper of the university. Today, you get 98% in literature and economics. So what does 80% mean as a benchmark? How has it come? What does it... So is it something that we would like to aspirationally have? Is it something that we have derived on the basis of a lot of research or empirical observation? Those are the issues. And therefore, when you say 56, I get this question when I go to the annual meetings, World Bank and our own. Why is, and the first time I was naive about it. So when I was asked this question, why are private sector projects not successful? And I said, who told you they are not successful? And they said, well, it's your report which says that they are not successful. And then I understood the context of how the 56 is being perceived by the outside world. So I think those are the two things. What could be done? I think a very good help or aid to private sector would be if there was a way for IED to involve itself with projects which are ongoing. Then we would probably be able to take corrective action and see that we actually improve. Otherwise, it's an ex post facto evaluation and really not much can be done about a deal which was 10 or 12 years old. I think that's about it. Really, we would like this percentage to go up. We would like to figure out how that can be done. But I think some amount of proactivity and maybe some amount of flexibility, because I do get the sense that there are times when people would realize, yes, there is merit in looking at it qualitatively a little differently, but the structure does not provide for it. So some amount of flexibility in that would go a long way in bridging that gap between perception and reality. Thank you.
I wonder why, when the performance was about 70% and nice, all of these issues did not come up, right? It's like that, as human beings. At IFC, they're going through the same issue now. Now that the performance is very low, now they're questioning the measuring. But when it was at high levels, nobody would question that. It was great. But I want to hear Nathan. What's your take on the performance of both sovereign and non-sovereign, and on this observation that there is an issue in the way we measure because the number is low now, right?
Let me first start with the overall picture, right? Start with giving a broad overview of how the bank is doing. On the sovereign side, as has been mentioned, there's been a clear upward trend. But when you look at the sovereign side, about 2/3 of the operations are on the infrastructure side. And about 1/3 is on the non-infrastructure, which is policy support and support for education and health and social sectors. On the infrastructure side, we see that the success rate is about 5 to 6 points lower than on the non-infrastructure side. And that's an important message. Why? Because infrastructure projects are obviously harder to do, take longer for the benefits to manifest itself. And hence, one can understand that infrastructure projects, the effort that's needed in terms of improvements in design and in improvements in aspects like sustainability take longer. Now, on the infrastructure side, what has happened? Energy projects are consistently highly successful. So there is a lot of lessons that have been learned on the energy projects, and there are serious improvements that have been made on the energy sector. Transport projects have improved from where they were, but have now plateaued at around 70%. Sustainability still continues to be an issue with respect to transport projects. What are the areas on the infrastructure side that could improve? Agriculture is a sector that needs to improve. Water is one of the big areas that ADB supports, and water sector clearly needs to improve as well. And sustainability was mentioned earlier. Sustainability is much lower on the infrastructure side, success rate for sustainability, than when compared to non-infrastructure operations. On the non-infrastructure side, what are the areas that can do better? Finance could do better, finance interventions. Education could do better. PSM operations have done well. So that broadly is what's happening. So in terms of improvements and areas that could improve. Now, in terms of regions, Werner talked about how CWRD has acted on a few things and how success rate of CWRD projects are improving. Now, when we look at South Asia operations and when we look at India operations, which is a pretty large portfolio of what the bank does, we see the India success rate is dropping. And we see that it's because of performance of some MFFs in India. And India is a big user of MFF. And so that's an area for the bank to focus on and try to see what is it that the bank needs to do to make these MFFs better. We see that the first tranche of these MFFs are performing much poorer than the later tranches. So there is some correction that's happening. But then why are the first tranches performing poorer? Are there design issues that are overlooked in the initial preparation of these MFFs? Have they been corrected on recently? So these are things that we want to focus on. Now, on the Pacific operations, Scott mentioned that serious improvements have been made, which is true, and we see that as well in terms of performance improvements. But then on the infrastructure side, again, on Pacific operations, it seriously lags behind the non-infrastructure projects. And the reasons are the capacity of the counterparts, implementation delays, contracting issues, and these are areas for the bank to focus on to improve operations. Now the non-sovereign operations, and so I want to
shortly to see if we can.
Yeah, very quickly. So there are a couple of things on evaluation when VP Gupta talks about, is evaluation an indicator of performance of the bank? Absolutely it is, because there is a lag to evaluation. So as there is lag when you look at a portfolio, when you look at the credit of a portfolio, there is a lag when you assess the portfolio as to when you commit the portfolio. So everything in life, there is a lag. And what we show is the trend in the portfolio. We're not showing absolute numbers. The absolute numbers, I agree, are not probably very relevant, but the success rate as a trend is very relevant. And so what we are saying is the success rate of non-sovereign operations are consistently lower than the sovereign operations over a long period of time. And the trend is on a downward trend. So it was in the mid-60s. It is true that it's based on a smaller sample, and it's more volatile than sovereign operations. But then there are messages that are coming out which needs to be heeded to, right? The portfolio is heavily skewed towards private equity portfolio and on finance sector operations. And so in addition to project level evaluations, we also do higher level evaluations. For example, we did one on equity just now.
Okay.
And the messages were similar, right? That private equity portfolio in the bank needs serious improvement. And so there are a lot of messages that come out at various levels of assessments. And I think those are the messages that need to be acted on. And I think many of these have already been acted on or in the process of getting acted on. And I think finance sector operations are also difficult. They turn around much more quickly than infrastructure projects. And so I would say those are the areas to focus on the non-sovereign side in terms of improving value addition.
Thank you, Nathan. Just clarification is that when we talk about small numbers, our practice here is that we evaluate everything that has come to completion or to maturity. So the sample is as big as whatever has been completed by the institution. And let me now go to Bernard. This is not the only report that is reflecting the performance of the institution. There are other reports that we have in the institution. We take this seriously in ADB. Apart from the independent report, there is also the DFR that is managed by Bernard. There is the APPR by PPFD. And they're all trying to project this performance of the institution, how the institution, what's the health of the institution, and to what degree is delivering what is expected to deliver. What way they complement each other, what key messages you take in terms of performance, Bernard, from these three reports?
Great. Thank you, Marvin, and thanks for having me here today. So maybe I'd start by saying that while some may have flexibility in their reports, ours is really a statutory requirement. So the board approves the corporate results framework with the targets, and then we have to report against it. So we don't have a lot of discretion in terms of what we're reporting on. We're telling the board how performance went against the targets. And I think there's different value to the different reports. Just tying it back to this conversation about success rates. Why are success rates important? I always use the analogy, it's like counting the dead after the battle. So it's nice to know that these projects were successful or not successful, but it's too late. They're already finished. So the value is really in learning about what worked, what didn't work, and then feeding that back into either ongoing or new operations. And here, I think, thanks to AED Dawson, we have going to have a great new section in the DFR, which is going to focus on the actions taken to address some of these either shortfalls or reinforce the points of success. We always had this difficulty with the limited time to produce the DFR. We get the data, we have to publish, we don't have a lot of time to think about actions. And AED Dawson said, why don't you instead undertake some actions and then in the next DFR report on them? So we're going to implement that change. So I think that's a crucial difference perhaps. We're reporting on the board-sanctioned indicators and targets, and we're giving management's perspective. Marvin, you always say, we have the same numbers, but we may have different interpretations, and I think we certainly do have different interpretations. Maybe I can just come in on one of those interpretations on the non-sovereign success rate. So one of the issues between sovereign, non-sovereign, I think Nathan mentioned historically it's always been lower, is the difference in weighting. And we ran the non-sovereign portfolio through the sovereign weighting system, and the success rate bumped up by 6 percentage points. So part of the difference can be seen in the difference between weighting between the two. Another is in the expectations. So as VP Gupta said, the target is perhaps the targets for sovereign and non-sovereign. There should be different expectations, and one of the reasons why is equity investments. So when you go into an equity investment, you don't accept or expect the same success pattern as you would for, let's say, sovereign investment projects. And in the future, if you look where PSOD and non-sovereign operations are going, the strategy pushes more into frontier economies, riskier markets, so we don't expect that the rates will go up dramatically. But we have 2 new indicators in the corporate results framework, which are going to track progress during implementation more seriously, more rigorously for both sovereign and non-sovereign. So these will help us course correct and hopefully pull up the success rate before we get to the stage where we're counting the dead after the battle. Thank you.
Thank you, Bernard. Well, we can conceive the success rate as the dead after the battle, which we should honor, right? They deserve to be honored. Or we can conceive it also as the returns or profits after the year. And no one would run a business without knowing what type of returns you have obtained from your investment. No one, that would be crazy. And the stock markets fall when profits come down. Well, our success rates are our profits. That's what the institution was created, not to generate monetary profit, but to generate development dividends. And so we should be careful about that, I would say. But time is running out, and so I want to turn the microphone to you before we go to some other questions that we have here. Please, questions from the floor. This is the business of everyone. Everyone should be able to say something here. Please.
Thank you. Thank you, Marvin. My name is Gambhir Bhatta. I'm the head of the Knowledge Advisory Services Center, an entity that works really closely with the Deputy DG of IED with respect to knowledge sharing. A question actually to all the panel members, but actually to Werner, by virtue of the fact that you're in the operations, and there's a very direct relevance to the evaluation work that was going on and the improvements in CWRD. In reality, the utility of a report like this for the work that you do, particularly with respect to knowledge that you get out of it, and whether or not that is something and how you could actually interact with governments, because we've got word that governments like in Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan are keen on working with ADB with respect to knowledge management, with respect to how they can actually better use the knowledge that has been generated to feed back into operations. And it's of importance to us because we want to know the extent to which you can work with governments in this area. And I presume that the evaluation report that has been done will serve as the evidence base to inform the context of how we're working. So I wanted to get your sense of the scope that you see of countries in the Central Asia region and Afghanistan, Pakistan, with respect to how much the utility of this particular report or these kinds of reports to the work on knowledge management. I don't know if that question makes sense to you, but it's something that would really help us a lot.
Yeah, thanks. Good question. We are asking ourselves also how we can make sure that this knowledge that is generated actually has impact with our client as well. I don't think there is so much value added of distributing it to the general public. It's interesting, but often it's picked up by the press to hammer certain interests, to say ADB is not doing well or this ministry isn't doing well. If you really want to have impact of this, I think you need to have more targeted communication to those people within the country that actually are in charge of this. So for me, one constituency is often Ministry of Planning or planning agencies, because that is where they need this feedback mechanism. They're also now in the business of basically establishing results monitoring. There's a shift from checking at the entry level towards more of an oversight and review mechanism. It varies in each country, but most countries have agencies that do monitor results, that look at development impact. And so it's important that actually those reports and that knowledge is targeted at those agencies. Thanks.
Any other question from the floor?
Thanks. So I was interested in VP Gupta's comments about the kind of natural human tendency we have to respond to perceived criticism with defensiveness. And I think this can be something that can harm all of us in terms of our efforts to improve. If you know, we all know that we do it, that when we hear any criticism, there is always that tendency towards defensiveness. And I'm just interested at a senior management level, what efforts are you making between IED and the rest of ADB to try to bridge that gap and work as constructively as possible, so we really make sure that IED's results are helping to improve our work and not leading to those types of clashes?
Okay, well, you know, I think it's about, just as the mindset, human mindset is naturally defensive about criticism, so also you have to consciously tell yourself that you must glean from the report whatever is useful. I think we do that all the time. Our transaction services department is in very close touch with the IED, even as the reports are being evaluated. So they spend time with us, and I think even when they feel something is not how it should have been, PSOD has the opportunity of telling them, look, this is how we think it was. Ultimately, it's the call of IED, and you have to respect it as it comes. You know, it's like any other thing in life. It's with ORM, you have an issue with ratings, but you can't say that, you know, no, your rating is wrong. They are the owners of the rating. If there is a rating, you have to accept it. Now, somewhere you obviously, you may call it a rationalization or you may call it an internal justification. You do then try to evaluate whether things are really unfixed or whether it's fine, it can just be a little better. But most of the time you get learnings from the reports which you can implement going forward. Now, some of them may already have been done because the reports are very old. But it's certainly useful, and I think the byword is to let an issue remain an issue rather than it becoming about personalities. So if IED feels that my deal in the Pacific did not generate an IRR, it's about IED viewing that deal as not having good enough IRR. It's not about Nathan Subramaniam saying PSOD is wrong or it's not up to the mark. I think that's the clear distinction you should make. Then you are looking at it as a third party. There is no conflict really.
Bernard and Nathan.
So I would say we've come a long way. So 4 or 5 years ago, our two reports had different numbers. So we couldn't even agree on what the success rate is. And the board rightfully said, come on, this is ridiculous. You have to have the same number. So now we all have the same numbers. So what we may differ on is why is the number low? What should we do about it? Which I think is a healthy argument, if it's an argument. And then also to give credit to Marvin, since Marvin came in as DG, we've had a much more communication and meetings and discussions. So we more frequently get on the same page. And if we agree to disagree at the end of the day, then we understand why. So I think having the common kind of understanding of the numbers and much more dialogue has really helped to bring us. Of course, there's still issues, but I think it's much better than it was.
Thank you, Bernard.
Yeah,
Nathan?
I'm going to try and answer the second question in terms of, is the bank learning? We have been fixated on the success rate and the numbers, right? 56% and whatnot. But that is the starting point of the discussion, right? It shouldn't be what we discuss till the end of this meeting. What we should be discussing is what leads from that number. So when IED evaluates anything, there are two hats that we wear, right? One is accountability, and the other is learning. Part of the learning comes from the accountability, because you're going to learn from your mistakes, obviously, right? And so if we say the success rate is low in something, we're going to obviously follow through with saying, okay, why is it that the success rate is low? And so we're going to point out areas of deficiency, areas of improvement. And so you can say the business has changed, but then you also need to step back and say, okay, has really the private sector operations or any part of the bank, has it really changed in the last 10 years? We are an infrastructure bank. We are operating primarily in the main energy, transport, and water and finance and same sectors. We are primarily doing project finance transactions, and in the financial side, similar kind of transactions. So obviously there is learning to be had, and we are repeating the same mistakes. In fact, when we go back and look at many of our projects, and when we look to say, okay, what are the areas that are working well, not working well, we see the same mistakes are being repeated. So that points to a lack of quickly learning and fixing things up. And so what needs to change? The incentive structure needs to change. It's not about being defensive or not, but the incentive structure needs to change. People should be allowed to fail, because we are in the business of working in emerging markets. We are in the business of development finance, which is a lot more complicated than investment banking, because you have a dual mandate. You have to make profits while showing impact on the ground. So people should be allowed to fail. There should be a bigger connectivity within the bank between the sovereign and the non-sovereign side. There should be a lot more upstream work. Private sector operations needs to get involved at the country programming stage. Needs to be able to go in and say at the diagnostics, at the country programming stage, need to go in and say, in this country, this is going to be my focus area. You sovereign side that's investing so much time and resources, please help me in terms of generating a good pipeline of assets. And then the private sector needs to come in with financing solutions, and so as to increase the size of the pie and create demonstration effects. So it has to be a concerted effort. It has to be an effort wherein you recognize your role is different, your comparator is different, your objective is different, and your incentive structure should allow that. And it shouldn't be that everything has to come to a head and then a decision gets made. Then you have missed the boat. You have to be able to make small changes along the way so that nothing comes to an head. So,
well, in the end, when things go well, we should celebrate. When things go wrong, we should reflect and check why it is happening. And many of like in any business, in our own industry too, the truth is that results are good or bad, in part because of good or wrong choices of ours, and in part because of the circumstances that we're facing on the ground. That's the reality. It's a blend of the two things. The important thing here is to understand to what extent the result we have derived are because of wrong choices, and then learn how to better adapt them. But in the end, I spoke about development dividends. AED Dawson, that number is just a reflection of how we are doing against certain standards. But what we are interested in is in these development dividends, in results on the ground. And now today there was this long discussion on OP, the 7 OPs. And so there is the expectation of results going forward, and we are going to be measuring that going forward. So, AED Dawson, what are your expectations in terms of our results? Are you happy with what we have so far, and on the framework that we have to measure our results 12 years down the road?
I think that there's a lot of work that's gone into the corporate results framework, and a lot of work gone into thinking about how we measure the operational plans. So I'm not sort of concerned about that. I think it is very much a question of culture change. I sympathise a lot with sort of Bernard's view about counting the dead after the battle and the value of it, and also with VP Gupta's kind of concerns about small sizes of samples and whether this information really tells us anything. I think that if I have one sort of criticism of this report, I think that it in a way leads us to put a lot more emphasis on the kind of actual numbers of performance. And that's important from an accountability point of view, but I'm not sure that it kind of really helps us to own our own failures. So I think we've got to think about different ways of doing that. And one of the things that sort of fascinated me since joining the bank was looking back at, what was the kind of the major area of weakness in performance. And Werner said it, sustainability, year after year after year after year, the same kind of poor performance on these areas. And it raised the question for me, well, what are we doing about it? What have we done about it? But when you dig a bit deeper, you do see that there's kind of a lot of thinking that's gone on about it. A lot of recent sort of specific work about the things that we can do to address it. And it's not sort of rocket science. We know things about, getting government commitment. We know things about assuring funding. We know things about systems for maintenance, which kind of help people to plan ahead. All of these sorts of things are things which we can put in place. The question for me always is, are we putting in place in the new portfolio? And that's why I'm keen not to look at just what the results of ex post evaluations are, but also to triangulate that in a way with the results of quality at entry and the ongoing portfolio. So that, with Strategy 2030, we can't afford to wait for 7 or 8 years for the results of new operations that have been designed under the new strategy to start to register in results. We've got to think about how do we get that information at a much earlier stage. And so, I don't think of it as necessarily counting the dead after the battle, but I do think we're kind of driving through a very long rear vision mirror, and we've got to try and reduce the length of our rear vision and the speed at which we can bring our lessons about failure to reality and reflect them in what we're doing from now on.
Thank you very much, AED Dawson. We could continue talking about this, but time is up. And so we should wrap up this exchange. I want to ask you to join me in thanking our panelists, and above all, thanking you for your presence and for joining us this afternoon. Thank you all very much.